happy to have you here today.
Thank you. It's great to be here. Is there a clicker?
Leah will be able to advance the slides.
Perfect. That's kind of like white glove treatment, actually. Yeah, I'll take that. Well, nice to be with everybody today. Maybe we'll go to the next slide. I feel scientists don't forget the importance of telling stories and connecting with people individually, and I'll try to do that a little bit about, well, it looks like I have some, here's a story about me. I make my slides at the last minute, and I sometimes have mistakes in them. Let's go advance one more. There's an animation. Yeah, I think that will do. Yeah, there we go. Let's go with that. So I was fascinated as a kid with looking out, well, having been deprived of the right, as I saw it at the time, of getting to fly in an airplane until like fairly late, until like in my teen years, which felt like an eternity. I was just so super fascinated with looking at airplanes and seeing the landscape below and thinking about why things are the way they are and where things are. And so I got drawn to the discipline of remote sensing, which is using satellite and airborne imagery to map and measure things across space. And so my first contact, some of my first research with the question of hot extremes was looking at wildlife ecology, looking at how bird communities, many of you might do breeding bird survey or Christmas bird count or familiar with some of that stuff. We were using those data to see how bird communities responded to extreme heat and drought events. And this just shows that they go down in abundance, sometimes pretty markedly after you have a hot, dry event. Next slide, please. And so after my journey through remote sensing started at Wisconsin and then Santa Barbara and then the US Geological Survey. And then I got the itch to study ecology, which is where that last slide actually came from, and landscape ecology. But coming to UNR as a faculty member, I continued this and I started doing some work looking at modeling the water balance of birds, basically looking at, do they get dehydrated and at what time scales? And the problem with that is that birds are such small-bodied little creatures that they can lose their sufficient hydration really quickly because they have to trade a lot of water in order to keep cool, basically by panting. So we looked at that. Next slide, please. But kind of accidentally, I didn't know I was going to be a professor or a teacher for that matter. But I found myself in this job and I really loved it. And I caught a taste of it TAing, but I really enjoyed teaching a class. Within a year of getting to UNR, I developed a class called Climate Solutions, where we don't just talk about the problem, but we look at what are some things that societies can do. And you know, let's be honest, why has it been so hard to do those things as a society and as communities? But that got me really thinking about my responsibility to address this problem, and then also had some really enjoyable experiences doing projects with kids. In this case, it was Dean's Future Scholar groups doing temperature sensor experiments out in San Rancho San Rafael. Next slide, please. And then rather unexpectedly, a former, I think, congregant, parishioner, member of this congregation, I believe, Dr. Stephanie McAfee used to attend here. She moved to Truckee, so she moved on to a different post, and she was the state climatologist for Nevada. And so they needed someone to step in for a year, and I said I'd be happy to do it. And so that put me in that role. And it turns out that even though it wasn't a role that I wanted, was really destined to do full-time continuing, I liked it quite a bit, that I was very happy to have the opportunity to continue as a deputy state climatologist. So kind of my journey here. Next slide. So I thought we'd transition to actually talking about heat now. Next slide. So here in Nevada, we are kind of a special place when it comes to heat because we have two of the fastest warming metro areas in the United States. Reno has been ranked #1 and Las Vegas has been ranked #2. course, Las Vegas is a lot hotter of a city, but one of the things about heat is it tends to be kind of a relative phenomenon. So something that can be dangerous in one city that's cooler might not have the same high temperatures as the equivalent danger level in a city like, say, Phoenix, that's very much accustomed to really hot temperatures. All right, next slide, please. And here's a real nice, clear illustration of what we're up against. Heat, and when you talk about the loss of life, loss of human life, heat is the #1 killer in most years and in most places across the United States. This is just showing the number of officially registered heat fatalities and other types of weather, environmental related fatalities. Next slide. This will be a quick one. It is the deadliest form of extreme weather. Next slide. And the reason is that our bodies are extremely good at dealing with heat, but even we have limits. It turns out the ability to sweat is a really unusual thing in the animal kingdom. For example, the birds I showed you, they don't sweat. They can only pant, which is a really inefficient way to do it. Or they poop on their legs too. So, you know, desperate times call for desperate measures. But when we start to get into trouble, our body gives us a series of warning signs, heat cramps, heat exhaustion, and heat stroke. But for a variety of reasons, sometimes people are not in a position to pay attention to those. They don't have the choice, or they kind of are in a context where they're just trying to grind it out. They don't think that they're vulnerable. So I really encourage people to take these things seriously. Next slide, please. And while it is more dangerous for people with sort of so-called comorbidities and more elderly people, it can strike the young as well, including athletes. Here in Nevada last year, I believe the number was 520 some deaths attributed to extreme heat. And I believe that's the Clark County number. So there's some really good reporting by Nevada-based journalists on this that I encourage you to check out if you're interested in it. Next slide. All right, so it's gotten hot. I haven't said really anything about why. So let's go to the next slide and take a look. Actually, let me just invite if anyone has any questions or comments so far and along the way. Dulcinea, you good?
Nothing on Zoom yet, thank you.
Thanks. All right, so this is a plot that our office produced, just showing from climate stations across the state and then comparing them to comparable stations in other locations, going all the way to the contiguous US to global. And it basically shows that Nevada is that's not the one I wanted. I wanted to have the smoothed one. There's another version of this, and it's advanced one more. Yeah, that's the one. Okay, I must have just covered it up. This one, it averages it over a few years, so your eye doesn't get distracted by all the ups and downs. And you can see that Nevada has shown a bit of a steeper increase and has had more of an increase in temperatures since the 20th century, essentially, to the tune of about 2 degrees on average Fahrenheit. Next slide. And, you know, if we look forward, there's certainly areas of uncertainty with understanding what's going to happen with climate change, not the least of which how much our emissions are going to be. But one of the most rock solid ones that you can say is that it's going to be hotter. and rather more specifically, these extreme high temperature events are going to be more common and more severe and occurring in more places. Next slide. So we know that this phenomenon globally is primarily driven by greenhouse gases. In fact, almost exclusively driven by greenhouse gases, the chief one of which is carbon dioxide. And be careful whenever you see two things correlated plotted together on a map, you can come up with all kinds of things. But even though this is a correlation that I'm showing you, behind it is a very, very clear mechanistic understanding and a lot of detective work to eliminate a lot of the other suspects. So it's not the volcanoes, it's not the sun, because they're going in the wrong direction, for example. So it's definitely greenhouse gases. Next slide, please. But that's not the end of the story. It's not just a global phenomenon. This plot shows the Boca Reservoir just across the border in California in the sort of amber color, and then the Reno temperatures. And these are nighttime temperatures, the summer minimum temperatures. And what do you see? How does Reno's trend compare to Boca's?
Nighttime temperatures are going up quite a bit more.
Mhm.
Or not dropping quite as much.
That's right. And I think anecdotally, people who've been in the community for a long time will sometimes talk about that and say they've noticed that. Like, they didn't used to need an air conditioner because their house cooled off enough at night, and they went out and bought an air conditioner or something. So we have been experiencing warming temperatures in the day, but even more sharply warming temperatures in the overnight here in Reno. Next. And this brings us to kind of the star attraction of today, the so-called urban heat island effect. And this is showing a transect across a community, just depicting daytime and nighttime temperatures. And you can see in both cases, those blue and sort of orange lines, they spike, they get higher when you go towards the downtown, towards the built up areas that maybe have fewer trees and more hardscapes, with some variation along the way. Okay, next slide. So, sorry, this is not directly crude, but if you use your imagination, there's an expression, opinions are like, everyone has one. So I think that actually holds true for hypotheses. People love to hypothesize about things. So let me ask you all, what do you think some of the reasons for the urban heat islands effect might be?
Concrete and asphalt.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, concrete and asphalt's a big one. What else? Or what specifically might be going on?
Lack of trees.
Lack of trees, yeah.
More exhaust.
Yeah, okay, yeah. Yeah, exhaust, like waste heat kind of stuff, yeah. Yeah, so let's go through a couple of them, and yeah, limiting airflow, absorbing heat, yep. Yeah, so one of them, and I think you've gotten at some of this with your responses, but one of the first things you might look at is, well, are cities absorbing more incoming solar radiation? And the answer is usually a little bit more, but not always. It really depends on the community. Some cities are actually lighter than the surrounding area around them, so it's not always going to be albedo, but albedo is basically how bright reflective you are. And cities tend to be a little bit more absorbing across that incoming solar radiation, but there are exceptions. Next slide. Trees, this is nothing that's, yeah, this is pretty intuitive stuff oftentimes. They provide shade. That's one reason we love trees. And you can see that with a thermal camera across the ground here, how drastic the different temperature differences are. So providing that shade on the ground surface. Next. And let me ask you this question: which of these surfaces do you think is evaporating more water, evaporating and transpiring more water?
The one on the right.
Yeah,
Plant.
all that lush plant life, it's not going to be green like that if there's not water behind it, right? So next slide, please. Yeah, this is a big one. We talk about humans being able to sweat. Well, vegetation and soil and things like that help basically the earth sweat and cool itself down. So when you have really, really dry surfaces with no water, all that incoming solar radiation, rather than that energy being directed to evaporating water, it's being directed to warming that surface. So we feel those high temperatures more without that evapotranspiration. Okay, next slide. And this goes for vegetation, but also soil. So when you have hardscapes with no ability for water to infiltrate, that can also contribute to that. Next, please. And waste heat, already, Brad had mentioned this one. All of those, almost all of those cars in this picture, because this is an older picture, and there's a lot of buildings, some with air conditioning units. There's waste heat that those produce. And in some kinds, there's enough of it that we can actually measure the difference, and it can actually contribute to warming of the cities. Okay, next slide. So we've seen a handful of these, and there's actually one more. Let me go. Yeah, so waste heat, thank you for that question. When you have a combustion engine, when you have an air conditioner, you're generating heat that's unwanted within that system, and so it gets ejected out. So our cars use waste heat to heat them in the winter, right? But in the summer, it just goes outside and it adds to the heat. And air conditioning units don't make the world cooler. They actually make the world a little bit hotter. They just make it cooler where we want it to be cooler. All right, next slide. And I think this was also mentioned. If you look at these surfaces, one is quite smooth and one's very, very rough, and that has effects on the sort of fluid dynamics of airflow over cities. And sometimes cities get this dome of stability that's built over them. It can trap particulates, and it can also trap warmer air, and sometimes that keeps the temperature higher, ultimately higher temperature. Next slide. All right. So we've seen a few, and there's actually others that I just edited out, but we've seen a few of these things, and I think the bottom line is that the urban heat island effect is actually a combination of quite a few things that produce it. And they can produce significant, amounts of warming for cities. Next slide. All right, so I think these are the important points to retain. Don't underestimate the danger of extreme heat. And then number two, it's a combination, what we see in our cities in Nevada, of global scale kind of warming factors, as well as more localized urban heat island effects. Slide. All right, so this brings us to what we can do about it. Next, please. So has anyone seen this adage before?
Yeah, it's like standard business fodder.
It is, yeah.
Behavior you measure.
It also kind of works in natural resources management. The first step to trying to manage something, in many cases, is to measure what's going on. And why do we do that? Next, and we'll do one more. And I've gotten creative with this and added map, because I think mapping is a form of measurement in space many times. And maps, I would argue, are really necessary for effective responses. They can help us address scientific questions. They can find the trouble areas that need more attention. And then one more slide. They can help us figure out what the right solutions are to mitigate the problem. Next. And they're also really good communications tools. When people see a map, they'll remember it more than someone talking for a long time. Next slide. So my research lab is involved in a couple efforts in this, and one of them is a NASA-funded actually project using a thermal camera aboard the International Space Station. And we convinced them that Las Vegas was a really important place to look at, because it was kind of underserved, under-resourced from this. It was a little bit behind Phoenix in its knowledge of the problem and response to the problem. Fortunately, a lot of good things are happening in Las Vegas in the past few years to move this along, but we're trying to help measure it with this thermal imagery. Okay, next. And just about a year and a half ago, there was an opportunity that a number of us jumped on, including Michelle, to get some resources from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, which had a campaign to map the urban heat island across a bunch of different cities, mostly in the US. And we were awarded one of the focus cities in the year 2024. And so, next slide, please. We ramped up in a hurry and got a bunch of volunteers. We had at one point about almost I think about 150 people involved at some level, like that got the training and to go be volunteers or were actively working on it. And this date is actually wrong. Advance it once, please. And I skipped one because we actually had to defer it twice, but we were really fortunate because we had a heat mapping campaign that took place on almost a perfect day. It was one of the hotter days of the summer. It was clear, it wasn't super windy. It was really a great day. Yeah, so what was this? Next slide, please.
And we should stop and thank the people in the congregation who participated, because some of them stepped up to volunteer their time and stuck with us, even though, you know, it had to be rescheduled.
Yeah, it took a lot of patience. That, yeah,
Yes.
that was great. That was one of my favorite parts about it. It's just the fact that we had so many people willing to spend that time and frankly, that gas money to do the work. And as this slide shows, folks in your congregation, as well as community groups, agencies, a whole bunch of people got together and said, hey, I wanna get involved in this. I wanna help my community. I wanna do a little learning. I wanna get outside and do this. And so we had a lot of people involved in planning it. And a lot of people also involved in executing it. And we continue to have a lot of people now involved in analyzing it and deciding what next steps our community can take that I'm about to seize. Thank you.
To explore an area of town I've never been in before.
Absolutely, yeah.
We've
Yeah.
had.
Over and over.
Yeah. 3 times even.
Yeah, we had the same experience. So I don't know if the folks on Zoom heard that, but Patty and Brad were 2 of the people who volunteered, and they were saying that it was nice and interesting to see parts of the community that they don't normally go to, and Brian and I definitely had the same experience.
Yeah, next slide. So it sounds like maybe about half the people here were participants, but I'll still tell you a little bit about, and feel free to chime in, Michelle, because you know it as well as I do. What this was about. One of the first steps that we got doing in the planning phase is we said, like, well, what are the areas that we want to make sure that we're not overlooking, that we're measuring, we have some sampling, and we decided one of the best ways to do that was to start with where are our public school locations, just because they are a good geographic sampling of the distribution of the population. And then we added other things like community centers, parks, athletic fields, shopping areas, etc. So these are some areas that we wanted to make sure we covered. Next slide. And then from that, our partners at a nonprofit called CAPA that works under contract with NOAA, they have an algorithm and a team that, because they're doing this for a bunch of cities, and they don't want the cities to have to reinvent the wheel. So they have some things that's basically, they didn't actually provide us funding, but they provided us resources, knowledge and data and planning to help us do the work.
And that cool little app that everybody had on their phone.
Yeah, the cool little sampling app. Yep. So we had 20 routes that looked something like this. This is just one of them. So there's 20 of these. They're about 30 miles in distance. And we had our volunteers cover them at 3 specified times during the day. Because it's important not just to use those maximum temperatures, but to see how quickly it cools down in the evening, and also to see how cool does it get after the overnight. So we're also sampling the early morning hours when it's really not very hot at all, but it's really helpful to know how that's responding, not only over space, but over time. So yeah, driving these 30 miles, and they were all done with a team of 2 people. The driver, of course, whose main job was to be safe and move the vehicle accordingly. And then I call them the mission specialist or the navigator, because they were responsible for the instrument and navigation. And NASA uses that term, so of course we gotta use that. All right, next slide, please. And these are some photos from campaign day or just leading up to it. You can see the sensors. There's a logger at the base, basically a little thing projected away from the car, and those little like Atlantic Record Building looking, the famous Atlantic Records building back in the day when you had record companies. That's actually a radiation shield, and you don't want the temperature sensor to be heated directly by the sun. You want to catch the ambient air temperature. So there's little layers and airflow in there. And the nice thing about going in a car, in some places in the past they were able to use bikes for this work, is you have an automatic airflow going through. And so it works really well to get a better reading. And of course, I don't know if you can see there's donuts. We had to provide something to motivate, keep everybody motivated and alert, as well as coffee. And the map on the right is showing the temperatures in the morning traverse. Colors are just relative, but you can see there's a pretty big variation in the temperatures. And I learned that Cold Springs is actually kind of cold in the morning. That's that one up the upper left, if you're not familiar with that area. All right, next slide. And the difference between the previous map and this is that was just depicting the temperatures directly measured along the transects, but our partners have these algorithms to spatially interpolate using like land cover information, topography, other data sets. And then they basically produce a model surface. And this is what meteorologists do all the time and geographers do all the time. We model things in space and try to make maps that are the best reflection we can get of what's going on out there. And so it just showcases a few of the ways that it varies across our community. A couple just to point out, this in the southwest corner. I don't think that's going to surprise people who are familiar with the area. That's going up the Mount Rose Highway. And we're seeing an elevation effect, okay? So I just want to make sure people understand that. That's mostly elevation driven. But even on the valley floor, we see some pretty big variation. There's that hot spot kind of in the middle. Transportation and really surface transportation infrastructure, mostly roads, but also runways. And then you get into things like warehouse areas and major parking lots, sometimes concrete buildings. Those things tend to have a higher temperature. And this is showing, I think, the afternoon temperature. And up there in Spanish Springs, I think some of that is a newer developed residential community. So it's fairly low density residential area, but the trees haven't, I think in some of those areas, the trees haven't been around long enough to have formed a really big canopy that you would see in, say, Old Southwest, which is one of the cooler areas around that's not at a high elevation. Yeah, so lots of spatial variation. Next slide.
Can I ask a question before we move to the next slide? This is Leah.
Yes.
And I have the benefit of being able to see this map really close here. So like I can tell this little blue patch and all of this red, that's probably Wild Island, right? That's like the water park. Is that kind of what we're seeing with these patches, these oases of blue amongst, especially here where you're seeing this concentration of very high heat, and then just to the corner here, it drops, 10, 11 degrees.
Yeah, I think those are water bodies, the golf range
Oh,
pond.
marina.
And then, Wild Island's a good guess, but I think there's a lot of hardscape around there. I think that's actually, the Sparks Marina that you're
This
seeing.
is what happens when you live in Carson City. You just make a wild guess.
Well, you can bust on Carson City stuff, I'm sure.
Well, thank you. Appreciate that.
Sure. All right, so what are we gonna do with all these maps? So next slide, and I'm gonna shift gears and look at other communities and an unexpected one perhaps. A community that's latitude is close to Hudson Bay, Canada, really far north. I'm talking about Paris. In 2003, they had a major heat wave, and approximately 70,000 deaths resulted from this, and a lot of them were in France, and specifically a lot of them were in Paris. And this is a real humdinger of a heat wave. It was kind of blew apart previous records. And sometimes 2 degrees Celsius, which is like 3 or 3.5 degrees Fahrenheit warmer, which is a big deal for a maximum temperature. Way outside of the previous records in many cases. And so that's a satellite image of the surface temperature anomalies, the deviations from the norms for that time of year. And this is a tragic look at the inside of a medical facility in Paris. And this is August in the 2000s. And I don't know if anyone's had a chance to spend any time in France in August, but that's vacation time, and their staffing levels were really stressed. And they were not ready for something like this. And the people that were in Paris, some were obviously still working and tourists and things like that, but a lot of the people left were kind of shut-ins, elderly folks, often in the high stories of buildings because the rent's lower sometimes in the higher areas, close to the roofs. And the building stock in Paris is not like what we have here. You know, it's not designed for this really high temperatures. And so it really cooks. Paris has one of the highest heat islands in Europe. So it's a real tragic event. And I just want to ask you, if you were the mayor of Paris or the president of France, what are some things that you think would be an appropriate way to turn this around for a future heat event?
Well, one of the immediate ones that comes to my mind is how do we get more cars off of the street to cut down on all of that waste heat?
Mhm.
And how do we get more people on bikes or e-bikes?
Mhm.
And how do we plant more trees, I guess?
Mhm. Yeah.
Better insulation.
Yeah, there's definitely housing, insulation and infrastructure kinds of questions too. Yeah.
I was living in New Jersey for several years, and one of the things that New Jersey did to encourage people to get better insulation was that they paid for half. If they determined that your house could be enhanced, and the house that I bought, they didn't really do a very good job of during the inspection. They didn't look in the attic area.
Mm.
And it turned out there was no insulation. And so I first noticed it my first winter. I was going around with, sweaters and sweatshirts. And even though the temperature was what I would, like 68, 65, 68 in the house, but I was cold all the time. And then I was driving home after a snowstorm, and mine was the only roof in the neighborhood that didn't have any snow. And I thought, that is a problem with that. And so I had the house inspected, and they came in and insulated both the sides. The house was built in the 1940s when oil was cheap. So that was how it was originally heated. And so for a $6,000 project, I only had to pay $3,000 because it was so important. New Jersey had decided that, this is important to help the heat, the heat problems.
Yeah.
During the summer.
Yeah. There's a lot wrapped into that story, I think. Changing
Yeah.
times, the kind of buyer beware stuff. There's also this concept embedded in that of like this return on investment time period, right? Because we know there's a lot of things we could do to save money in the long run, but a lot of times they require upfront investment. And I feel like we're in a time where we only want to look at the costs right now, and we're not looking at the benefits in the future sometimes. And programs like that are an example where you do look at the benefits, because even though that have direct benefited you as the homeowner, it probably long-term benefits the community as well, for a number of reasons. Great. So any other
Any thoughts from our Zoom folks, Leah?
Yes, there's one from Brian who said rooftop gardens.
Yes,
And personally, I'm a big proponent of, paint all the roofs white or get lighter colored shingles, paint the roads white, get rid of the roads.
really quick story. I don't want to get too distracted. The white road thing is interesting, but we also have to worry about melting snow after snow events. So the transportation people are really worried about snow and ice lingering too long. So having a road surface in our kind of a climate that is dark has some advantages. So we need them to change color. That's what we need, depending on the season. All right, next slide. So the French really did take this seriously. They implemented, they looked at it from all levels of government, from, there's mayors of not the boroughs, but the arrondissement inside Paris, and then there's the main Paris mayor, there's the region, there's the department, there's the national government. Everybody was working on this problem, and they did a whole range of things, ranging from trying to find thresholds for when they should sort of sound the alarm and tailoring that by neighborhood, an early warning system, planning for staffing for emergencies. They got that more robust, and having the materials, the stocks of like oral rehydration and other things like that. Education and social measures, encouraging people to look after each other, and just simple things like that are actually not so simple in society sometimes. The infrastructural stuff, so things like, can we insulate certain things really hard with some of these old buildings? Can we put in air conditioning in certain areas where it really needs it? And is our grid ready for it? And yes, increasing tree canopy, reducing hardscapes and car-centric infrastructure, and those things kind of go hand in hand. Cars are very space-hungry form of transportation. And if you think about the way these things break out, they're either directed at trying to reduce the magnitude of the heat island, or they're trying to help society and people respond and keep people safe once it's happened. So these are sort of different things, but working together. Next, please. So that brings us back to our community. What are some of the things that we should be doing, that we could be doing, and maybe in some cases that we are already doing? I'll start with a couple that we're doing, I know of. We're analyzing data. We have students and agencies that are looking at the data to try to understand it, in community groups. So that's a big part of it at all the different angles, from parks to transportation. People are looking at it right now. Learning from the way communities are experiencing these problems and what their needs are, because sometimes people in ivory towers don't always know what's going on out there. So it's really important to have discussions and community forums. Public awareness is always a big thing, and I feel like the media's gotten the message out more this year than 5 years ago. There's a lot of interest in not only tree planting, but planting trees in ways that can be sustained, right? Because you gotta keep those suckers alive. And if it's a rental property where the owner isn't motivated, it's challenging. And one of the things that we're doing locally to help hopefully advance a lot of these things is we're planning a Northern Nevada Heat Summit in early June, and really kind of targeted at the folks in agencies and community groups that have some responsibility for something having to do with heat or heat response, something that's relevant. And it's going to be a lot of folks, but I think it'll be open to the public as well if people are interested. It's our first time doing it, so we'll find out. But we're very fortunate. We have a really good model from Southern Nevada. There's a group called the Southern Nevada Heat Resilience Lab that I work with regularly. That's out of the DRI Las Vegas office. And they have really tackled that steep learning curve to try to figure out what's going on. So they've had public meetings, and they've had planning sessions. They have tried to figure out what a cooling center is and how to how to make it so people will go to it. And one of the challenges that the cooling centers are sometimes open 9 to 5 kind of situation. And for people to get there, they have to go outside in the heat to get to it. It's hard. These are hard things for everyone to figure out what to do, but they are doing the necessary work to move it forward. And we're really fortunate that we can benefit from some of the things they've learned, and we have good relationships with them. So yay, Nevada. Next slide. And finally, I just wanted to wrap up. Any other questions before?
Well, it's not really a question, but one of the things that I had heard that Las Vegas had been more successful than Northern Nevada in encouraging solar panels. And I know when I first moved here and I live in Carson, and I was hiking up in the hills west of town, and I looked down and I thought, here's this town where we have something like 240 sunny days of the year. And I was alarmed at how few solar panels I saw. And then I discovered that apparently NV Energy has made it, has done whatever they can to prevent, for instance, all new houses that are being built in Carson, and there are several different areas where it's just, lots of new houses. And they're not being outfitted to, the easiest time to make it possible to put in solar is when the house is being built.
Sure, yeah.
And they're not doing that.
Right.
So, the NV Energy has made it, difficult to get permits to do it and, whatever. And apparently in Las Vegas, the people were up in arms because they wanted solar. They realized, hey, we live in a town that has lots of sun. And there was such an outcry from individuals that Nevada Energy sort of backed off, like, oh, well, okay, if you really insist, we'll make, and so it was a public outcry that made the changes that forced Nevada Energy to start paying attention and making it easier to get solar.
Yeah, I think it's the structure of their sort of business model and the way they're regulated, I think was set up before this situation. The idea that you'd have people sort of being able to be off the grid and actually contributing electrons to the back and selling them back, and they have their infrastructure overhead to pay for it. It requires some work for sure. And I think that's a great front to advance on, is public outrage when they can't do it.
Yeah, and I know we're a little off subject, but just to add to that, your point about how rapidly things have changed. I mean, 20 years ago, solar panels were outrageously expensive, right? They were like almost $100,000. Nobody was going to put that on there.
Yeah.
But the prices have dropped so dramatically that things have changed. The other thing that I'll say in terms of solar on residential is it's largely the builders, because it costs money. And especially right now with concerns about inflation and affordability, developers are trying to bring those costs down as much as possible. So there's definitely things that need to be done, but it's more than just NV Energy.
Yeah, I think, that's a great point.
So I'm wondering about what some of the next research questions are that you or your team might be looking towards now that we have this beautiful map or picture that helps us understand not only how hot Reno gets, but how it affects different neighborhoods and different times of day. What are some of the next research questions that we should be looking at?
So research questions, I'll mention a few that we're working on. One is the idea there's not a single heat island. It's really these multiple factors. And we are working on this concept of a heat atlas, where you look at the surface temperature, the actual temperature of the ground surface, which could be really, really hot. Where you look at the air temperature and you're looking at them in time, like throughout the day. And you find that it's not just like, this is a hot area, this is a cool area. It's more nuanced. This is an area that doesn't cool down at night. And that brings certain challenges, like physiologically for people sleeping, that's a certain kind of issue. This is an area that, while it maybe cools down at night, it sure gets really hot during the day. And that's a different set of concerns. So that really basic work of kind of understanding the dynamics, that's one of my PhD students is working on that. We're looking at disparities, trying to, and I have some slides on that in a minute, so I won't talk about that right now, but we're looking at that issue. We're looking at how heat intersects with the transportation network. I was a PhD student of a colleague of mine that I'm also involved with working on that. And then I have a student who's looking at parks and how people use parks and whether they use them as a place to help stay cool in the summertime. So yeah, there's a lot of things, and that's just the ones that I'm involved with. And I know that like other people are doing different, there's people doing modeling, they're doing process-based modeling so they can play with like a sandbox of the city and say like, well, how will it change if we change the building's heights and have different trees in different places. And the Southern Nevada Water Authority works a lot on figuring out what trees give you the most bang for the buck for using the least water, which is a huge issue for them, and the maximum amount of cooling. And so, yeah, there's all kinds of stuff. Yeah.
Leah? Did I see a question in the chat?
There is a question in the chat from Penny. This, I'll go ahead and read it. Actually, I think there's two. So a peripheral question. I heard that the atmosphere where satellites are will narrow due to climate warming. This means that there will be less room for communication satellites and space debris, resulting in fewer satellites. Is this true?
I know it has effects on the upper atmosphere. Like, for example, what's warming us is cooling a certain layer in the upper atmosphere. I do not know, while that sounds plausible, I do not know enough to be able to comment on that. So I'm sorry, but that's interesting.
And then thank you for that. And then a second question, will Dr. Albright's research help develop a heat map for gardeners? We have zone maps for cold, frost, freeze, chill hours, and need the heat maps.
Oh, that's a really interesting question. Haven't thought about that one, but that's a good one. I also want to mention that I've been talking rural heat is also very much an issue, particularly when you have like farm workers and things like that. We just have been focused on this because of the resources that we had, but I don't mean to at all imply that rural heat is not a problem too. And thinking about gardeners, I hadn't thought about that before, but I will bring that up next. I'm going to meet with a farming forum and I'll ask them what they're not strictly speaking gardeners, but I'll ask them because they probably have some interesting ideas.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you for that. Thank you from us out here in the rural, interested in keeping our gardens going.
Absolutely. I can go to the next slide and then we also have some more questions. So this really, for me, this really is like really pops right in front of my face looking at the data and talking to people about it. This is a question of, among other things, it's a question that deals with environmental justice. Some of you might have heard that term, might use that term, but I'll just throw a couple bits on that. First of all, one definition of justice that works pretty well. Next slide, or next button. A simple definition is it's kind of the fair, what's fair, of course, is a question, but the distribution of the benefits and burdens in society, right? There's other types of justice you could consider, but that's one more of a distributional justice. And this concept of environmental justice, next. This is actually, one more advancement. This is actually from the EPA's now archived off government sites, definition of environmental justice, the fair treatment and meaningful involvement. So they're getting into a procedural question as well of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. I think that's a useful definition. I don't think it's complete because there's also just the distribution of the underlying exposure to the hazard is really different across communities. So let me show you a couple examples. Next slide. So is urban heat an environmental justice issue? Next. So this is a map of Las Vegas heat deaths, and it's per capita, and so I'm just gonna stand and point really quickly, and maybe, I don't know if someone can do this on the mouse, but these two areas are relatively small populations, so it's kind of an anomaly that they're super red. What I want you to focus on is this. And if you look, basically you see a stark divide between the West Valley, you know, places like Summerlin and well, here Henderson, but East Las Vegas and parts of the North Las Vegas, the city of North Las Vegas, those have higher per capita death rates. And that really strongly corresponds to a lot of socioeconomic factors. Next slide. And we could just look at the temperatures and compare them to census block groups for income and also for the percentage of non-Hispanic white population. And we see that the places that have higher non-Hispanic white populations tend to have less exposure to the really high temperatures. Next slide. We see this with air pollution. On the left, we have the LA basin. At the top is a map of, I don't remember what that one is specifically. It's a sort of socioeconomic vulnerability index. Basically, the darker areas are more like vulnerable communities, minoritized communities, lower income communities, and the ones mostly on the coastal communities and in the mountains are not. And you can see it really corresponds to air pollution exposure. And the one on the right shows us that it breaks it down a little bit further. It looks at the drive-through communities where people live next to freeways. So they're not contributing to these local particulate and NOx and ozone pollution. But they're experiencing it. So it really breaks it down in that distribution of the benefits and the burdens. So another really stark environmental injustice issue. Next slide.
Is there a difference between the top of the green, for instance, and the bottom of the green on the chart on the right?
They're stacked, and it's showing the contribution to that inequity. So if that, for example, in that community, the slide on the right, for example, Hispanic communities, approximately what, 60% more difference between the exposure and the cause. And so you can see both of them stacked on top of each other. So it's saying that they're much less responsible, but they're much more exposed to it in terms of generating those pollutions and living in them. Next slide. Another issue that I don't think gets considered as environmental injustice as much, but I would argue that it very much is. It's the issue of traffic violence. It's, you know, road crashes. That's very prevalent. We've made choices as a society that produce that, and you don't have to go very far to find people whose lives have been torn apart by this issue. I lost a brother from it as a child. Next, please. And this has been sharply rising recently after a couple decades of decline. Next slide. And just like the other issue, it's something that really hits people disproportionately. You can imagine folks without permanent housing, folks that have to walk and bike, not by choice like me, but because it's the only option they have, are much more exposed to these issues. I sometimes call this kinetic pollution when people get hit by a massive high-speed vehicle. Next slide. And then going back to the global scale one more time, it's worth reminding that the per capita emissions that we have, especially if you look back into time because CO2 stays in the atmosphere for so long, much more responsible in what we sometimes call the global north. And for the most part, countries that are more exposed and vulnerable to the worst of the climate change events are not those countries that have generated those forms of pollution. The next slide. So I think my whole career, I've lived in a place where it wasn't risky to say that we have an ethical responsibility to care about stuff like this. And we even pledged allegiance as kids and maybe continue as adults in community meetings. And there's a new version, there's other versions of this. This is the OG version of the Pledge of Allegiance, but one thing that hasn't changed is that we haven't removed the "and justice for all" piece on this. So I hope that people take their, Pledge of Allegiance seriously, because I think that is one other reason that compels us to try to uncover what's going on and try to find solutions to help more people be safe from these environmental hazards. I think that's all I have. Just some accomplishments.
Thank you. That was such a great note to end on.
Thank you.
Yeah, so we're right at 10 o'clock. If anybody has a burning question, we could probably slip one in before we let people go.
In May, you have the climate, this coming May, right?
I think June 5th is the
Yeah,
plan.
will we get, will public will come through that with a pretty good idea of what actions we should take?
I think our thinking is as much as the public is welcome. I feel like we are still processing as people who are working in the area that we're kind of just figuring things out. And I think one of the things we'll do is to probably have some public communications about the results of it
Yeah. And so just to reiterate for the folks on June, the heat awareness fair, for the folks on Zoom, the heat awareness fair is in June. And I think one of the things that we could do, going back to the beginning and this idea of having good information and then using that information to take action, which is what Brad is asking about, how do we take action, is contact your ward representative for the city of Reno. Make sure that they are aware that this heat awareness, and there's nothing to say that you can't contact people in Carson City as well, because some of these learnings, I'm sure, could be translated to other parts of Washoe Valley. Make sure they know, make sure that they know, and that they're thinking about how to incorporate the results into specific policies for the area.
Yeah, and there are some who are very active in looking at it, I know, and that's great. And there's some state level legislation that's being considered about incorporating a heat plan for planning for communities.
Good point. Yeah.
So there are things
contacting
happening.
Your state representative is a good idea too. All right, well, thank you so much for joining us today.
Pleasure.
We really appreciate it. Thanks to the folks on Zoom for joining us, and thank you, Leah, our intrepid Zoom host.
Thank you all, and lots of thanks coming from the folks here on Zoom. Thank you for the interesting and worthwhile presentation and the emphasis on environmental justice. With that, I'll end the recording.
You.
Okay. Trying not to blow the matches everywhere, but.